They say silence speaks louder than words, but sometimes silence is all that remains when truth becomes dangerous. On a national broadcast, millions watched as Erika Kirk, widow of the late conservative figure Charlie Kirk, was asked a question so direct, so human, that her answer should have been simple. Do you think they've caught your husband's killer? She paused. She took a breath. And then, instead of saying yes or no, she spoke of trusting her team, of autopsy reports, of evidence collected. To most people, it was an awkward moment on live television. But to those who knew the story, to those who followed every detail of that cold morning, her hesitation felt like a crack in the surface of something much deeper. Because behind that silence was grief, fear, and perhaps the weight of knowing more than she could ever safely say. Charlie Kirk's death had already fractured the nation. His voice, once a thunderous force in political commentary, was suddenly gone, taken, according to official reports, by a single gunshot wound. But from the very beginning, something about that wound didn't add up. The bullet that was said to have killed him was a .30-06, a powerful rifle round, but there was no exit wound, no ballistic consistency, no trace of impact that matched the weapon described. Investigators offered technical explanations, but to those who had seen the autopsy, the data didn't align. And when the very ground where he was found, the official crime scene, was paved over and sealed just days later, even before defense attorneys could review it, trust began to collapse. Who authorizes the destruction of a crime scene before trial? Who signs off on removing the last piece of physical truth from an open investigation? No one had answers. In the weeks that followed, the media flooded with analysis, talk shows, podcasts, political channels. Some called it tragedy, others whispered something else, that maybe this wasn't a random act of violence, maybe it was a message. Erika Kirk stayed quiet. Rarely appearing in public, she became an unwilling symbol, a widow carrying the burden of a divided nation's suspicions. When she finally appeared on national TV, many hoped for closure. What they got instead was confusion. "I trust our team," she said, holding her composure, choosing her words as though each one had consequences. She didn't cry, she didn't accuse, and that was the moment that changed everything. Because from that silence, the public made their own conclusions. Some believed she was protecting her husband's memory. Others thought she was protecting herself. A growing number suspected she was protecting something or someone else. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We, the public, often demand clarity from those who are drowning in trauma. We want a soundbite, not silence, a confession, not confusion. Yet, imagine for a moment being in her position, your partner gone, your children watching the world pick apart your pain on live television, your every word analyzed, twisted, reposted, and weaponized. Maybe you'd hesitate too. Maybe you'd choose your words carefully, not because you're guilty, but because you no longer know who you can trust. Still, questions remain. Why did the federal investigation seal key evidence? Why did witnesses retract statements within hours? Why did major media networks suddenly stop covering the inconsistencies? These are not conspiracy theories. These are facts of omission, holes in the timeline that no one has filled. And when institutions go quiet, speculation takes their place. Across forums and social platforms, users dissected every frame of Erika's interview. One commenter wrote, "She's terrified. They killed her husband in front of the whole world. She's pretending everything is fine just to survive." Another responded, "She knows more than she's saying, and she can't risk saying it." It's easy to dismiss online voices as noise, but in this case, that noise carried an unsettling consistency, the kind that often appears when the truth has been buried under layers of official narrative. For months, experts and former law enforcement officers privately questioned the handling of the case. Why were the initial reports redacted? Why were ballistic findings retracted? Why was the lead investigator abruptly reassigned to a different division without public explanation? Even seasoned journalists admitted off-camera that something about the timeline didn't make sense. Still, through all of it, Erika Kirk kept her composure. Her interviews were rare, her words guarded, and in the spaces between those words, the public began writing their own story. But perhaps this isn't just a story about one woman or one man's death. Perhaps it's about a system that failed both of them. A system that asks victims to trust the process, even when the process erases evidence. A system that tells the grieving to speak their truth while quietly warning them of the consequences. A system that values public image over private justice. And maybe that's the real crime here. Not just what happened on that day, but what happened after. Some might argue that the public has no right to doubt the investigation. Others will say the inconsistencies speak for themselves. But one fact remains. When truth becomes uncomfortable, people in power often call it speculation. And that's exactly how stories like this fade into silence. As months pass, details are forgotten, evidence is lost, witnesses change their statements, and before long, the narrative is rewritten, clean, convenient, unquestioned. But for those who watched that interview, for those who heard Erika's trembling voice say, "I trust our team," the unease never went away. Because maybe trust isn't always a sign of faith. Sometimes it's a survival strategy. We must ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did a country that prides itself on transparency come to accept mystery as closure? How did we let a widow's grief turn into a battleground for politics, ratings, and speculation? And if this could happen to her, on live television, in front of millions, what happens to the countless families whose stories never make it to air? This isn't the end of the Erika Kirk story. It's a chapter in something larger, something that questions how truth is managed, how justice is delivered, and how easily silence can be misinterpreted as peace. As months pass, details are forgotten, evidence is lost, witnesses change their statements, and before long, the narrative is rewritten, clean, convenient, unquestioned. But for those who watched that interview, for those who heard Erika's trembling voice say, "I trust our team," the unease never went away. Because maybe trust isn't always a sign of faith. Sometimes it's a survival strategy. Stay tuned, because this story, this silence, still echoes. And somewhere beyond the noise and headlines, the truth is waiting for someone to ask the right question again. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, remember to subscribe and follow for updates. The deeper we look, the clearer the pattern becomes. Because in true crime, the silence often tells us more than the evidence ever will.